Good evening, and welcome to Columbia Climate Conversations, Gender Equity and Climate Change. I'm Benjamin Kiesling, a postdoc in geochemistry at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory.
And I'm Karin Acosta, a fourth-year PhD student in Earth Environmental Sciences.
I want to start tonight by amplifying the work and the words of the Native American Council at Columbia University. The Lenape lived here before and during the colonization of the Americas. We recognize these indigenous people of Manhattan, their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. This acknowledgement stands as a reminder to reflect on our past as we contemplate our way forward.
We would like to thank the Earth Institute, the Climate School, and for sponsoring tonight's event. We would also like to introduce Caroline Felix, senior at Columbia College and Columbia Climate Conversations intern. Caroline is a senior studying the history of the African diaspora. She is passionate about international politics, human rights, development, and gender equality, and has worked with organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Malala Fund, and the UN. In her free time, she writes a column for the Columbia Spectator, reflecting on intersectional issues in her community. Please join me in welcoming your moderator and host for the rest of the evening, Caroline.
Hello. I think something that's really important to our work here with Columbia Climate Change is to be able to highlight the cross sections of issues that maybe on the surface level, we don't necessarily see a connection. And that's why today we're tackling gender equality and climate change. As we know from reports from the UN, 80% of the people who are actually displaced by the climate crisis are women. And in order to live in a world where gender equity is a reality, women need to have access to safe, healthy, and sustainable environments and resources. And in order to live in a world where sustainability is also reality, women are an important part of that equation. So I'm really excited to start our panel today with these amazing panelists. I'll let them introduce themselves. We can start with Lauren.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to hear this panel. Caroline's already told us why it's so great that we're having these conversations. My name is Lauren. I'm a senior studying sustainable development at Columbia University. I'm also originally from the Bahamas, and I'm the founder of the Eco Justice Project, which is a community platform and resource hub that educates about climate change and climate justice, but specifically about intersectional climate justice as it relates to social identities. So that's very important and part of what got me into gender equity and thinking about the intersection between gender and the climate crisis in the first place. I'm also doing a fellowship with Girl Rising, currently creating a documentary about climate change in New York City through the eyes of women of color. So that's also been really pertinent to this work. So I'm very, very excited to be having this conversation with you all today.
Next, Nadia can go.
Hi, I'm Nadia Okamoto, and I just graduated from college last June, currently based in Brooklyn, and I am the co-founder and CEO of a brand called August, which is a sustainable period care brand working on figuring out how we can improve our period care today.
And of course, Karin.
Hey everyone, my name is Karin Watson. I'm a design student from Chile, but I'm actually based in Barcelona. And I was part of Amnesty International Global Youth Collective, where I work especially on sexual and reproductive rights. Also part of the Women Deliver class, Young Leaders Program class of 2020. And recently I co-founded Latinas for Climate. There is an organization that is working towards climate justice from the intersectionality point of view, and of course from the Latino point of view.
So I'm super excited to have all these amazing panelists who are bringing such rich perspectives. So I'd love to start the panel with a question about what led you to work in this space where you're kind of addressing the intersections of climate change, girls' education, menstruation, and gender equity. Anyone can start.
I'm happy to go. For me, I definitely started off not thinking about sustainability probably as much as I wish I would have, to be honest. I started because I was just passionate about periods and learned about period poverty, and naturally working on the nonprofit side, when I was focused on like getting period products to people who needed them, I needed to get a lot of period products. And so basically like a year into working on the nonprofit side, and this was in 2015, I was working with all of these companies, like begging them for product, to donate product. And I think it wasn't until like a year or two in when as I think my peers started talking a lot more about environmental action, and growing up in Portland, Oregon, where, you know, everybody started, you know, talking a lot about sustainable choices in your everyday life, did I kind of stop to think about the sustainability of the period products. And from simple Google research, that's when I learned that most period products take 500 to 800 years to decompose. And like most maxi pads have enough plastic for 3 to 5 plastic bags. And I think for me, it was kind of a wake up call of like both my own ignorance, but I think also, you know, as we recognize the intersection of like, okay, you know, of course, this is a gender inclusive issue, but primarily women who are using these period products are creating a lot of, you know, plastic waste that's then being thrown out. And I think for me, for the last few years, it was just starting to think a lot more about how we can make period care more sustainable. And that started a few years ago when I was on the nonprofit side, trying to then distribute a lot of menstrual cups that were a much more sustainable option, plastic free, and then also lasted someone a lot longer. And then now being on the brand side, now making biodegradable pads that are plastic free, and as a company as well, committing to higher standards of sustainability, both in the manufacturing process, and then also in being like offsetting our carbon footprint, which is something we put a lot of thought into to make sure that we're not like one of those brands that's just like planting a fuck ton of trees, you know, but like really investing into change that's going to offset our carbon footprint today, mainly around like renewable energy and things like that.
I think kind of going off of that as well, I think Nadia did a great job of making it so clear that sustainability just shows up in so many different facets, especially like even thinking about like menstruation and, you know, periods. Like you don't, I guess, typically think about the environment in conversations like that, but the plastic, the waste, the production, all of that, you know, really goes into it, even distribution, as Nadia was talking about. So I think, you know, for me personally, as someone who's always kind of been interested in like climate and sustainability, like I said, I'm originally from the Bahamas. So I just started out from a very young age being really engaged in the environment, being engaged in my community through like, you know, beach cleanups, what have you, environmental demonstrations. And I think it was really important for me to see more people that looked like me doing this kind of work. Especially as a Black woman, you don't really see many Black women at the forefront of the environmental movement. So I think for me, on one hand, it's definitely, you know, yes, like we need to show that, you know, gender is a huge part of it, that, you know, climate crisis affects vulnerable populations more than other populations. A vulnerable population is women, is girls. We need to talk about that. But also just in general, I think bringing more women to the forefront to share their voices and stories, I think is so important, especially from like a storytelling perspective, but to like hear these experiences that you don't typically see is really important, I think, in the climate space.
Yeah, I think it's it's actually funny because it was kind of the same for me. I started working on human rights and women's rights, for example, like the abortion situation in Chile, things like that. And then working on human rights, then you realize that actually like the biggest threat to human rights right now is the climate crisis. So when I realized that, I started to work on climate justice I never say actually like the word sustainability, but I work towards climate justice because I came from the human rights world. So also like working on that, you realize that first the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and then a gender issue, as Lauren said, it affects disproportionately those who are already the communities most marginalized. So of course, women and girls, you can see how it affects. So working from that point of view and being from Chile, that is a country that also is being super affected by the crisis. Being from Latin America also, you start to realize how how it affects our countries and how we actually don't really have a say on the crisis and what's going on. So also that's why I wanted to actually come to this fight and start like fighting to bring the Latin American voices to the movement.
Definitely, I definitely see what you guys mean, and I think something that many of you guys mentioned is that you started this work when you were younger, and how it's really shaped you as you've kind of grown up. So I would love to ask the question about, what role does childhood experiences and the early socialization and development play in shaping the way that we think of gender equality? And what's missing from girls' lives, let it be in education, to kind of combat those issues in your experiences?
I can go. Actually, for me, it's, as I was saying, like growing up in Chile, there is actually a super conservative country. You may think that it's a progressive one. Maybe now it's getting better, but when I grow up, for example, we used to have like basically one of the five, like I think five most restrictive bans on abortion in the world, for example. So the access to sexual and reproductive rights, it was awful. So like growing up like that, you actually realize that there is a problem. And I started working on sexual and reproductive rights education when I was 17 through a project. And there I actually realized that like how important it was to actually, for example, come to school, and work with the children to try to empower them and to tell them that sexual and reproductive rights, it's actually a right that they have and they should be empowered. And I don't know, for me, I think it was then when I realized that we actually had a say, maybe like we actually had the power to change this reality that we have in Chile. And now, like 6 years later, I think we actually have seen a lot of progress in the country. So yeah, I think like realizing what I was living as a kid, as a young person, and then trying to work from that to make a change with kids who were living the same. I feel that now those kids are actually working on that, a lot of them. So you can see, like, try to plant a little seed and see the change. At least in Chile, we I don't know, we were super lucky that now we're seeing the change, like in the streets, but also like at the government level. So
I think going off of that, I think empowerment is one of the biggest things. I think when I, try to reflect on what it was like to be like a little girl in primary school, middle school, like there was no one like really defending women or protecting women as much as we needed, as much as it should have been, whether that was, not seeing ourselves represented in like government and politics and policies. I also, come from a very conservative country. There were no women in parliament making any decisions. And because of that, even thinking about something like being able to pass on my citizenship, to my children, like the Bahamas still has not done anything in that. And I think that happening at a really young age, I think as a young girl, as like a growing woman, kind of teaches you that you don't have rights, that you don't really matter, that you're not on the same playing field as men. And I think that type of socialization is like extremely disheartening, but also very harmful for young women in like being able to speak up. Like, I think, aside from just the education aspect of it, I'm even thinking about, what being socialized as a woman even did for my like self-confidence when it came even to getting into the environmental space in the first place. Because not only am I a woman, I'm also Black, and also often like the only Black woman in a lot of my classes. So I think being, taught not to speak up, not to be too loud, not to take up too much space is really difficult when you are trying to, do important work and be able to advocate for yourself and to advocate for others. So I think that as part of my socialization was really important. And just in education, I still don't think we talk about the climate crisis enough. We don't talk about sustainability, especially in a well-rounded way that extends beyond just the trees, the ocean. We need to hear more about like the people, but also the communities that are most affected. So in girls' education, but education in general, there's got to be more than just the stereotypical education that we're getting when it comes to the climate crisis, sustainability. The intersections need to be in the curriculum.
Yeah, I think similarly, like, so I grew up in my early years in New York City, and actually grew up a few blocks away from the World Trade Center after 9/11. And so for me, even though we didn't talk about sustainability, we talked a lot about air quality and like wearing masks outside, and also my sisters and myself having heart, like lung breathing complications because of a lot of the exhaust. And so I think I thought a lot about the environment, like quality of the environment that I was growing up around. And then I moved to Portland, Oregon, which is like much greener than New York City, also much whiter than New York City. But I think that's where I started thinking a lot more about air quality and things like that. And I think growing up in Portland and that since moving away, it's been honestly really sad to see, you know, how the forest fires in Oregon have affected air quality. And on top of not being able to go outside over the pandemic, my family couldn't go outside because of the air quality, because of the smoke from the forest fires. So I think that growing up in the Pacific Northwest made me a lot more cognizant over like how we're affected by the environment and like the safety of people as well. On the kind of gender equality side, totally agree with what Lauren said too around empowerment. Like I grew up with domestic violence and sexual abuse in my family, and it wasn't something I ever questioned, right? I think for the first decade of my life, it was just my normal. But when my parents divorced and I started like hearing other women talk about what they've been through and like labeling abuse as abuse and labeling, like even hearing the term like violence against women, or learning that there was a word that was domestic violence and it, you know, resonated what I was going through, I think it created like a sense of solidarity, especially with like my mom and my younger sisters, but then also other women. And I've been thinking about this a lot, like as I think about gender and like understanding gender as a social construct and like how I identify like within my gender. And it's kind of heartbreaking and in some ways empowering to realize that a common experience that I feel connects me deeply to women who are strangers who I've never met before is the past experience of some sort of sexual violence or sexual harassment, right? And I think that that's like a heartbreaking thing. Like, what is the equalizer amongst women, or what we experience? And it is this kind of solidarity of surviving growing up in this patriarchy. And so I think a lot of my early childhood experience, while it didn't feel so empowering in the moment, I think fostered a lot of the passion that I have for what I do now.
Those were like really amazing points, and I really appreciate the kind of different perspectives you are bringing. All of you guys have brought, especially kind of considering, you know, how does a gendered experiences, especially one as a woman, kind of impact your daily life. I'd also love to kind of hear, how do you think, you know, with that gendered experience, climate change kind of intersects with that, and the way that you're experiencing, you know, not only your gender but also the climate crisis as it, you know, as it continues.
I think I can kick this one off. I think, again, bringing it back to what I was saying before about, you know, the climate crisis and social identities, intersectionality. I think it's so important for us to recognize the way that the climate crisis disproportionately impacts vulnerable populations, and one of those populations being women. Even thinking in terms of, let's use like poverty for an example. Poverty and the climate crisis, obviously, if you don't have a safety net, if you don't have access to resources, the climate crisis is going to hit you harder. Thinking about the fact that 70% of the world's poor people are women is an insane statistic in the first place, but also just in general, thinking about, you know, like poverty, thinking about women, you know, having restricted access to land or financial resources, or domestic violence, or limited access to like decision making in politics. If there's a migration, not being able to move, not being able to recoup, you know, from a natural disaster. I think these are kind of things that we overlook, but the more that you think about it and you recognize like women's experiences, especially the financial ones, I don't think we talk about like financial abuse, especially thinking about like, you know, like as a form of domestic abuse as well, and how that disproportionately impacts women. And then when you're thinking about the climate crisis, the lack of social safety nets, it's difficult, I think, to tackle the climate crisis under those conditions. And I think that's why when it comes to climate policy, we need to have like that gendered aspect of it, or we need to understand how to address gender equity, more directly, I think. And I think we would see that that would increase and improve a lot of different things. Also, one more thing, women are doing great work in terms of climate as well. And I think the more that we bring women into positions of power would be great, would be absolutely amazing for seeing some actual change.
Yeah, I agree with the last thing you said. That's so true. Also, like in the context of Latin America, for example, like most of the farming communities, for example, are led by women. Also, like most of the indigenous communities that are working on this kind of things, the girls that are the people that are leading these fights against climate change are women. In Latin America, we also have the problem that because of, I mean, from the intersectional point of view, it also affects not only like in the climate change side, but also like the women that are working like against the climate crisis. Sorry, I'm like this is super late now, and my English is like breaking. So I'm really sorry. But okay, so women that are fighting against climate change in Latin America from indigenous communities, for example, they are not only affected by the crisis, but also they are being attacked and threatened by companies, by sometimes governments, because of speaking up against companies that are causing the climate crisis. So you can see also that most of them are women, and they also are subjected to sexual violence, for example. It's also like a way to attack them. So you can see how like it's like a layer and another layer and another layer of violence against women due to a climate crisis.
I think when it comes to the climate crisis, I still have a lot to learn. And I think that for me, like, it's just a natural part of being like 23 on the older side of Gen Z, where I'm surrounded by so many peers who care so deeply about it. And I think for me, like, I have been really trying to just learn as much as I possibly can about it. I think naturally with the work I do now with August, like, we're thinking about sustainability initiatives every single day. And I think really adopting the mindset that it's never a solution that's been reached, but always kind of this constant mind for improvement. Like, we actually had a shoot today because we're doing a small update on our pads so that the wrappers are compostable. And a lot of even making that slight adjustment took months of research to analyze the whole supply chain, right? And I think that, I think something, Lauren, you said earlier around like, even when we think about sustainability around how products are made, that's something that I never thought about before. Like, and now it's kind of brought a whole new sense of awareness to me, like the cup that I'm drinking from and my phone case and where that's made and my pen, and not only like the materials that it uses, but also like how it's distributed. How does it come here by boat or by plane? And I think that's something that I had never thought about before. And I think climate change can be really challenging to understand, at least for me. Like, I am not a STEM person at all. And so I think that for me, like the science, I absolutely support the initiatives around it, but personally, it's hard for me to understand. But I think what I'm really passionate about is like, how do you create educational materials where it is easy to understand, and also options of, more sustainable products that we can use that we're going to be using anyways, right? And I think that's how I think of pureed products a lot, which is these are products people are going to use regardless of whether or not we exist. So why don't we make options that are more sustainable? And also keeping in mind that like the current option we have right now is not maximally sustainable, and we need to get to a point in which it is, and kind of constantly working to improve that is something that I'm really focused on. But I would say that, to be honest, like, I think for me, like, understanding the climate crisis is one where I'm more of a listener, and I honestly look to experts like the other two panelists here around like how to take action, resources to learn from. But I think it's something I think about a lot more on the business side around how do we take that learning and apply it into designing a better supply chain.
Yeah, definitely. I think I really kind of connected to what Karin said, discussing like, not only how like women are disproportionately vulnerable to the climate crisis, but also, as you mentioned, are very much leading the kind of work there. I was thinking about Liz Chikaje, I believe is how to say her name. She's a South American indigenous kind of climate activist, and she recently won an award for her amazing work as an educator and religious leader. And we see this, and she is not unique. Women around the world, from every corner are coming, are stepping forward to protect, their land, their homes, and their communities. But I'd love to know from your perspective, even though women are, definitely playing a central part in responding to climate change and are essential if, as we create policies towards to address the climate crisis, do you think that gender issues or and women in particular are overlooked when we discuss climate change? And how do you think we can create gender responsive not only policies but also let it be products, and culture to highlight that intersection between climate change, sustainability, and of course gender?
I think I'll kick us off a little bit. I think there's obviously a lot of different ways to do this. I agree 100%. Gender is definitely overlooked when it comes to these issues. I think the first step to me is always education. I think I really resonated with what Nadia said. I think there's no one knows everything. And I think that's the first step of getting involved in any issue, is just knowing that you have so much more to learn, especially the more that you learn about something, you're just like, there's so much more that I need to understand. But when it comes to understanding, I think gender as this thing that's connected to the climate crisis, it comes from education, it comes from reading, it comes from sharing resources. There's so many different, organizations that are doing great work. I think, amplifying those, learning about the work they're doing, seeing if you can get involved, I think is definitely one of the, first steps to making sure that, there's like widespread understanding of what's going on. And then from there, I think that'll be when gender responsive policies come into place. I'm always, a big proponent of thinking that like individuals can make a difference and that social change can impact policy change. So if within our culture we create, this environment where gender and climate change, or just gender and social identities in general, are intersecting more, then I hope that policies will be able to reflect that. In terms of creating gender responsive policies in general, the politics is kind of where I don't know exactly what those policies look like in full transparency. But I hope that we can get them. I think that they're so important, and it comes with reproductive rights. It comes with, thinking about the ways that women are made vulnerable and creating policies that stop those things. So poverty, reproductive rights, education, so many more different things. But yeah.
Yeah, I also think that education is key, and also like making information accessible, because as Nadia said, for example, I'm not a STEM person either, and it's actually really difficult to understand. One of the key works that we try to do with my organization, Latinas for Climate, we try to translate the information in a more like common language, but also trying to make it accessible not only in English, because most of the information is only in English. So we try to translate to Spanish and Portuguese. So we make it accessible to the community, most of the communities in Latin America. So I think also like education and making information accessible is like maybe the first step for people to get involved. And yeah, actually, I think it like gender is very overlooked. I think in the past 2 years, maybe we've seen like an improvement on that topic, especially like at the high level discussions and all. But I think like in 2020, only 20 countries have like a gender action plan for climate change, which is only 20 countries, and we see that also like women that are actually like involved in the discussions at the high level are very, very few. Like we really need more women working on that. And I think for me, like creating awareness or like recognizes the links between climate change and gender, it's key to start like creating an effective adaptation, an effective adaptive response to climate change. And also because we know like if we if we actually do this effective adaptation to climate change, we can also improve gender equality and the access to sexual health and reproductive rights for a lot of women. So I think like recognizing the link and trying to create awareness about the links between these two topics is very important, because I think it's a topic that is actually really overlooked, and we need like more people to understand there is a thing and it's going on, you know.
Kind of building on that too, I think that, you know, a result of the patriarchy is that there's this stigma around like women's bodies. And I feel this a lot, you know, having worked on the policy side on periods, which is, even if it wasn't necessarily about sustainability and the climate crisis, when we were trying to talk about legislation around taking down the tampon tax or getting period products in schools, shelters, and prisons, like we showed up not only with the mindset of we need to talk about the policy change, but before we could even do that, we had to get whatever representative or governor we were talking to be comfortable discussing periods, right? Like there's this layer of stigma, which is like, first and foremost, you know, take TikTok, for example. It's hard to bring attention to something like abortion, TikTok, on TikTok, or periods, when things about these topics often get taken down, right? And we experience a lot more censorship around it. And oftentimes when you walk into a room, primarily like male politicians, and you say, hey, we're here to talk about menstrual health as it relates to sustainability, there's kind of this immediate like shut off where you're being tuned out. It's making them uncomfortable and they're not really hearing you or taking you seriously. And I think something I experienced a lot when we were doing legislative advocacy around the tampon tax was we had to really try to convince the often like male political representative to become an advocate for periods. And a lot of the times, like they didn't want to talk about it, right? And while they recognized that it was an important issue, when it came to talking about, you know, something that is rather gendered and something that they didn't themselves experience, they had that discomfort, right? Like they couldn't even say the word period, and it's the time of the month, and oh, women get this thing. And I think that when we talk about like, is gender overlooked when discussing climate change? Absolutely. And I think a lot of it, as you know, the other two panelists alluded to, comes with the fact that not a lot of them are women or menstruators. And so I think that especially around reproductive rights too, there's this heightened level of like before steps that have to happen around breaking the stigma to be able to have the conversation about the policies and the policy change before you can even have that discussion.
I think kind of adding on that, Nadia just reminded me of something. I think on this like question of how, you know, we have these conversations about these things, it reminded me of this article that's posted on the Eco Justice Project, if anyone wants to read it. But it's about basically just understanding when it comes to like birth control and how we have these conversations about reproductive rights. On the one hand, it's just like, yes, we want more women, you know, in these countries to have access to these things. We want, you know, for reproductive health to be a more like widespread thing that women have access to. But also a lot of the time when these conversations happen about birth control, you also get like the eco-fascism at the other side of it. You get like, oh yes, like population control. You get like, we have to reduce the population. We have to do this for climate change. And especially in like, you know, like countries that don't have as much access, it's like almost targeted in this way, like for these countries to be getting this information about population control and climate change. And I'm even thinking about, you know, in some of my classes, even here at Columbia, when it comes to addressing the climate crisis, it's kind of framed in like, we need women in the global south to be having less babies. We need more family planning, and like that type of rhetoric, I think is also important when I think we're talking about like reproductive rights and birth control, because you can't bring those ulterior motives and agendas into it. And I think it's important to be having the right kind of education that addresses those issues and problems with it. And I think when you don't have that access, that's when you get things like forced sterilization in, you know, different countries. That's when you end up with, I don't know, just like policies that just aren't good for women whatsoever. So I think keep that in mind.
Exactly, and like, making policies that are gender responsive, and also like as we, especially as we kind of reform our policies to address the climate change is extremely, important because you don't want to have a situation where like forced sterilization, and eco-fascist rhetoric is being used to under the guise of the climate change, but of course is upholding misogyny, upholding patriarchal, perspectives. And to Karin's point, in order to kind of envision a world where climate change and gender equity are kind of addressed, a lot of the issues of policies are coming through. I was thinking about, for example, GDP. GDP has many blind sides. One of them is the environment. GDP does not account for environmental destruction, but also does not account for the labor, many forms of labor that women do, so such as informal labor, domestic labor, etc. So I think as we bring gender into these conversations, we can assure that as we're pushing for policies on multiple fronts, we can have policies that assure that we have a world that is sustainable, that where environmental justice is achievable, as well as gender equity kind of worked in there. I guess another question I'd love to kind of hear from you guys is, how does climate change affect women across various issues, so such as healthcare, reproductive justice, also with menstrual care, and what are the intersections between reproductive rights and climate justice?
I think that as as you were kind of sharing before, like there are intersections everywhere, and the climate crisis comes up in every single issue. And I think even when you look at the statistics around the people who are displaced by the climate crisis, right, and with the majority of those being women, I think that especially in the US, we're seeing a lot of access to reproductive care and like even access to abortion clinics very determined by geography, right? It's very much like what state you're in, and a lot of states that are have poor populations and also more conservative populations have less access to things like abortion, right? And so I think that a lot of it is there's that direct relation around how much geography and environment is tied to the access you have to reproductive care. I think similarly, a lot of it comes down to resources. Unfortunately, in the world that we live in today, access to reproductive health care or even fucking period products are expensive and come at a price. And when the climate crisis is so tied to poverty and accentuating experiences of poverty, it directly impacts someone's access to reproductive care.
Yeah. Also, like, we know that the climate crisis, like the first impact of the climate crisis that we see are natural disasters, and we see how natural disasters are affecting, as Nadia said, like the geography, or for example, I don't know, for example, in Chile, like we have a huge problem with droughts. So people without water, without access to sanitation, you can see there, like, of course, their health is being affected by the lack of water. And also, again, you see that women are especially affected by this because, for example, of menstruation, or because when they are trying to get to the services of health, or sexual and reproductive health, or even like only trying to access to water, there are being affected, for example, by sexual violence. When women have to walk in places that are like remote or rural, they are subjected to the threat of sexual violence. So as I was saying before, like again, we can see how all these different things intersect. And also we know that climate change is also affecting maternal health. It strains health systems. And there's this report by Women Deliver that also speaks how like there is an overlap between the populations who having the most vulnerability to climate change, and also the populations who face barriers to the realization of their sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we know that, again, it's like two different layers of discriminations, or like rights being affected. And we know that we need to tackle both in order to like make the change, you know, they're like really linked. And we know to acknowledge the fact that they are really linked in order to like work on both or work on one, you know, like separate or together, they're really, really interlinked.
Yeah, I think both of you have just given such great answers. I think trying to add, I think something, I guess something new into the conversation. I think something that I've been thinking about even recently is coming back to this idea of like empowerment, but also, you know, women and young girls, thinking about girls' education, girls having agency. I read an article recently, I don't remember who it was by, but it was just about like child brides and like early marriage and thinking about how that impacts the climate crisis as well. Like, you know, girls are having these, you know, families very, very early, but also like how that ties their dependency, like to, you know, these structures of like being a mother, being a wife, and how that basically like traps them in these situations with like financial responsibility and dependency, et cetera. But I think gender-based violence in early marriage, I also think something that I've also been thinking about in terms of like healthcare and how we can like relate this to the climate crisis, to the gender crisis in general, is just that women don't get listened to. Like I have a very good friend of mine who has endometriosis, and it's like one of those things that just doctors don't know anything whatsoever when it comes to women's health. And she goes and she's in pain. No one believes her. I have even with Black women all the time are talking about like Black women and maternal mortality don't get listened to. So I think when it comes to that aspect of the health and like the gender crisis, I think even just thinking about that in terms of climate change as well is really, really interesting, especially with like what we're talking about, like natural disasters, access to resources, you know, all of that just impacts your overall like state of well-being. So yes.
Yeah, just to add a little, I think it's very important the point that you say about like child marriage, because there are a couple of studies, especially in Africa, that are linking the climate crisis to child marriage because of, for example, the lack of food or water makes the families to actually like do these practices because of the climate crisis. So it's a very important topic to talk about also.
Wow, that was an amazing, like, I definitely didn't think about that, but now, yes, go on.
I have one more thing to add. You just reminded me. I think we might have read the same article, but I think it was also talking about how like, you know, like when there's like stressors going on, so whether that is a natural disaster or I think it was might have been Uganda. I don't want to misquote, but I think it was saying that in Uganda, when like rates of drought are higher, then also rates of like female genital mutilation are also higher. So I think there's been like a lot of connections being made between that as well. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I guess like to bring another dimension of that, I'm thinking of education. So we've also seen this simulated through COVID as well. As soon as like there's like financial stressors on families, if it's between like their sons and daughters and getting an education, it tends to be the daughter's the first one to kind of get the cut, and therefore not receiving education. And especially if the climate crisis is causing financial stress, community stress, obviously environmental stress, that kind of affects how girls are accessing education. Through COVID, we've seen it with a really high rates of girls having to leave school and not return to school, also with rates of domestic violence, how like community stress also kind of gets refunneled into like stresses on like gendered issues. But as you guys mentioned, how women empowerment is a really big part of kind of addressing the climate crisis. As we know, women and girls around the world are making amazing efforts to fight against the climate crisis. I'd love to know what you guys hope to see in the future, and what advice would you give for the environmental movement as a whole to be more responsive to the needs of women and girls?
I think include women and girls in the conversation, specifically those who are affected by the climate crisis.
That was great. I could 100% agree. I think, yes, I would love to see more women, especially women of color, at the forefront. I would love for more of them to be in positions of power to make decisions. Like I was saying, women are doing such great work. I could riddle off a list of so many women in like the climate space that I admire and that I look up to, and I would just love for them to have a platform and be the ones making decisions. So I think that's a big part of it. Girls' education, prioritizing that, making like girls' education a big, like a big issue, an issue to address, I think is also really important. And the curriculum also needs to be fixed. So just things we talked about before.
Yeah, I mean, those answers are great. And adding on that, I think, yeah, like it's very important that the solutions and the change actually comes from the communities that are the most affected. For example, women. So I think it's very important to have women and also girls in the in the conversations, because like, I hate this phrase, sorry, like like girls, they are the ones that are gonna suffer the most the crisis in the future, not only now, not only like suffering now, but also in the future. So I think it's very important to have them also in the decision making spaces, and also to work on the empowerment of girls on climate change with education, because it's actually, I think it's a fact. I think I read a study about like how girls' education can be like a feminist solution to the climate crisis. So it's a fact that it's related, and that if we empower women, if we empower girls, we can work on more effective adaptation and mitigation measures for climate crisis.
Yes, and without a doubt, as you mentioned, girls' education is definitely a feminist aspect of kind of addressing climate change. Women as like, let it be like caretakers, as people who are stewards to the earth, let it be through also as farmers as well. When we kind of educate the women around the world as to what are the most effective ways to not only surely get to take care of your family, but take care of the environment, to ensure that it can stand for generations. That education is crucial, and as we know, because women are very much seeing the effects of climate change, would probably be really willing to do so and to kind of enact that kind of change, throughout their lives in whatever sectors that they live in. But it's definitely kind of taking that first step to engage with women, see them as as actual agents of change, and not as just kind of victims of the climate crisis, but actual like agents of change to stopping addressing the climate crisis. I know Nadia actually mentioned TikTok before, so I'd actually love to know more about the kind of platforms for information sharing or community building that you guys are using and are excited for when connecting the issues of gender equity and climate change.
Yeah, I definitely spend the majority of my social media time on TikTok, but that's actually a relatively new thing. I started on TikTok about 6 months ago, and am now at 2.4 million followers. And so I think that for me, like a lot of what being on that platform and having that virality has taught me is that it's a really powerful tool, right? And I think that that sort of virality in the algorithm like is not something I've ever experienced on another social media platform. And I think that the beauty of short form content is that it's very visual, right? And it can go viral very quickly. And I think that for me, like I don't speak out about the climate crisis as much as I hope and wish that I will eventually be able to be. And a lot of it is because I am not an expert, and I very much acknowledge that. And I think I'm still doing so much learning. But I think for me, I also feel more and more the responsibility to talk about the issues and amplify other voices who don't have that platform. And I think that's where I've used a lot of the duet function to like amplify those other videos. But honestly, the TikTok has been a way that I've been able to connect with a lot of people who care about sustainability in this Gen Z demographic, because I'm talking a lot about how we're making pads that are biodegradable versus other pads take 5 to 8 centuries to decompose. And so we've built this following of millions of people and continue to build the company with a community of people who care a lot about the environment. And so we continue our community building actually on an app called Geneva. And Geneva is kind of like Slack for Gen Z. And we have a few thousand members in there, and it's all constantly in conversation. And we actually have a chat room about sustainability where people are sharing resources, learning about the climate crisis, and talking about different organizing efforts that are happening around the world. And I think for that, we have hosted like 200 different events, and a lot of them are Zoom calls with members from the 40 different countries that are represented in the community. And we've done a few events talking about the climate crisis specifically, and it's been really eye-opening, especially as someone who's grown up in the US and lived in the US my whole life to hear about how the climate crisis is understood around the world. And I think also how it's being prioritized in terms of social issues that are discussed. But I think that for me, what I'm excited about with like the work that I'm doing right now is that as a brand living in a capitalist country, there is a lot of responsibility and accountability that I think for-profit companies or social enterprises needs to take on, which is like, you're given a platform and what do you do with it? And you're building resources, so what do you do with it? And so I think the more that continuing as we grow is how I'm most excited to highlight a lot of these issues. Again, I think I'm learning. I'm more of a, okay, here's a platform. How do we get the right voices on it rather than I'm going to speak out about it because I don't know what I'm talking about. And I think, I actually met Lauren before we even launched and worked with Lauren to kind of amplify a lot of the work that she was doing on our platforms. And it's something that we really, really love to share because we suddenly were engaging with all of these, especially young women of color who were saying that they felt really seen and felt like they were excited that a brand was finally talking about it.
I think for me, also as someone who follows Nadia on TikTok, I love the content. You're doing a great job. But I think for me, in terms of platforms, TikTok slightly frightens me. I'm doing my best, but I think short form content, I agree 100% with what Nadia is saying, but it's also harder, I think, because you're trying to pack so much, but you have to try to, make it punchy. I think as someone who like created my platform during a time when like infographics were really popular, I kind of got into this habit of like, okay, it needs to be like flashy. It needs to like condense this really nuanced and complex topic into like 4 slides max, or like 7 seconds on TikToks max. So I think that becomes really difficult. I've been exploring longer form content recently on the ecojusticeproject.com. There's some articles, some spotlights of people who are doing amazing work up on the website that I would recommend reading. But I think for me, when it comes to platforms, I think I am very, not frightened, but I think it is very intimidating to be called an expert on an issue that is such a huge issue. So I think I've kind of pivoted my platform, or just even like the way that I engage in conversations like this about climate, from this perspective of like, oh, like here, let me educate you, to like instead being like, let's foster this community. Let's like create a platform, or let me share some resources with you, or like, let's learn together. Let me show you this cool thing that I just saw and we can talk about it. I think that's like my ideal type of platform. That's what I'm working on cultivating with the Eco Justice Project. But yeah, I think sharing educational resources in a way like that and building community, I think is really important for like cultivating like real change around these issues.
I actually feel you a lot, Lauren, because I'm very frightened by TikTok as well. I can't actually use it, but I do realize there is a very powerful tool. For me, I mean, mostly from the work of Latinas for Climate, we mainly work from Instagram. And as you say, Lauren, like this slide, these infographics are very, they fall short on all the information that we need to share. But at the same time, I think it's a very powerful tool, like as a door, to the other content. So for example, like in our community of Latinas for Climate, we use a lot of different networks, but also we are trying to work now like with a blog for people to write their stories, to share what they're thinking, also trying to build kind of like community libraries with papers, with articles and different stuff that we can share with our community, and also like trying to work, as I said before, like on translating stuff and things like that. And also like spaces like this one, having these conversations, webinars and all. And what we are trying to do now also is like sending like a newsletter with like blog posts, with articles, with different like opportunities and news for people to engage also with the topics on all different platforms, and trying to also like point towards like an intergenerational public, because we need to work with a lot of different platforms in order to reach more people of different ages. So yes, trying to do a little of everything.
Yeah, definitely. I think issues of the climate crisis definitely have a unique space on social media, because to Lauren's point, it's definitely a complicated issue. In one way, it's very clear, but it's also very complicated when kind of explaining it. So there is this kind of interesting kind of straddle between, like, you know, wanting to make sure it's accessible and people on anywhere can get it, but also like wanting to be able to really highlight the nuances of what's really going on. And that's definitely something that, like, you know, activists like yourselves and, you know, and like throughout other circles are really kind of finding out. But it's really exciting to see how you guys are all really approaching it in different ways. I know there was a question about kind of government bodies and civil society and the climate change. I believe we already answered that, so definitely thank you so much for asking. But I'd love, since you guys also all highlighted amazing work that you guys have been doing, we'd love to kind of hear from your kind of final remarks, any ways we can follow your work, keep connected with your organizations and companies, and just assure that, you know, we're keeping up with your the kind of great things you guys are doing.
So to support me, you can keep coming to Columbia Climate Conversations events and panels like this one. Also, the Eco Justice Project has a website and Instagram. You can check those out. There's also a TikTok. It's not really popping like that, but I promise I'm working on it. And yes, that's it. I believe that's everything. Yes.
I'm just at Nadia Okamoto on social and working on August, which is itsaugust.co. Definitely join our community. And honestly, for me, I'm here to do a lot more learning too. So I'm excited to, you know, continue just like staying in touch with everything you're doing at the Columbia Climate School as well.
Yeah, Kaleidos in Instagram. I can write it because it's kind of weird. And also like support the work of Latinas for Climate. We're on Instagram. We have our page with the blogs, and also in the page you can subscribe to our new newsletter. So that actually it's very exciting for me because I'm working on that. So if you can subscribe, that would be awesome. Yeah, that's all.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for coming and just sharing your amazing wealth of knowledge and your experiences. I know some folks said they aren't an expert. I had a good friend that always says that you guys are all experts in your own experiences. And that's the kind of work we really need, along with different kind of perspectives to kind of address the climate crisis. And thank you so much for the amazing audience that stayed engaged and asked great questions. And hopefully we'll see you, everyone. We'll see you guys in a few weeks for our next event coming up. So definitely tune in for that. But yes, I hope everyone has a great night, and thank you for coming.
Thanks for having us. Bye.